Colin Coulson-Thomas, the Director General of the India, UK and Europe operations at the Institute of Directors. Stephen Adams, partner at leading consultancy firm Global Counsel. We have with us Arbinder Chatwal as well, the head of Indian advisory services at BDO. And Sumit Jalwal, the CEO at SBI Cap, also joining us. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us today. Lots to discuss when it comes to bilateral trade and the way forward. A whole host of opportunities to be explored, as was outlined, in fact, by the two heads of state that we saw last week. What I really want to understand from you, and go through this gradually, is really how to tap into this opportunity. So let me just start off with you, Stephen, and get a sense of, first and foremost, what some of the key takeaways were for you from last week's events.
Well, I think maybe a point that's worth making just when we start is that when we talk about bilateral trade with India in London, that can mean two things. It can mean UK-India trade, but it also, in a very important respect, means EU-India trade, because the UK is part of a single entity that negotiates its conditions of market access with India. And hanging over this conversation in many ways is the prospect of an EU-India FTA. And I think one of the interesting things perhaps for this panel to kind of probe really is the extent to which the lack of a strategic trade agreement between the EU and India is holding us back in terms of trade and business, and the extent to which, in fact, business has done a very good job of working in the absence of such an agreement. And my background actually is as a trade negotiator. I, in a former life, professional life, remember signing off the press release for the EU FTA in 2007, and the expectation at that point was that this deal would maybe take 6 months. And of course, here we are 7 years later without that deal. So I think maybe that's an interesting question for us to look at. My simple answer would be that, in fact, one of the lessons of the last 8 years is that you can do an awful lot in the absence of an overarching agreement like that. And I think the experience of businesses in this room and the businesses we've heard from this morning are that there are lots of low-hanging fruit that you can pick off. But in the absence of an overarching trade agreement, we're missing opportunities to lock down conditions of market access, provide certainty, provide predictability. And I think while it was good to see Modi and Cameron recommit to a deal, it still seems to me that it's going to be quite a big ask.
All right, so lots of challenges ahead. Professor, let me get your views in on that as well, and take off from where Stephen left off.
I suppose the thing that struck me about the visit and the Wembley event, and in fact all these international events, the same thing in North America, and you see it in India, is a huge wave of expectation that's actually been created with a new government coming in, people being excited. But of course, in terms of making things happen, then the new government has to work through existing people, existing mechanisms, all the frustrations that you know if you deal with India on a regular basis. And in terms of making things happen, it strikes me that, and particularly if you look at the initiatives, things like Skill India or Made in India or Smart Cities, they could easily disappoint. If all you're doing, for example, in smart cities is just putting in broadband and hoping that things will happen, there's a great danger of this wave of enthusiasm being lost. And in terms of business opportunities, in terms of the UK, I think if we can really work with the grain and actually work with some of these major initiatives to actually help the momentum, help them move along. I was struck recently, in fact on the 5th of November, appropriately in Westminster, I presented one of the Digital Challenge Awards, and it was an award for skill and inclusion. And of course, looking at some of the winners, from around the UK, and some of the innovative things they were doing, not just big telecoms companies, but small entrepreneurial businesses, you think, well, India really needs that in terms of achieving the Skill India objectives and in terms of achieving smart cities that don't just have a broadband infrastructure, but you turn them into intelligent communities. You use that infrastructure to deliver government services, to include marginalized groups, across India. There's a huge opportunity to transform India on the back of some of these initiatives.
Right.
And I think if people really focus on the opportunities where they are working with the major initiatives, then there's a much greater chance of them succeeding. And that will be a win-win, you know, both for India and also for the UK. But it's a partnership of equals, and it's a partnership based on the latest technology. You know, it can't be based on yesterday's technology and things we've done in the past. So I think we need to look beyond, you know, where we're successful at the moment, you know, and think about the industries, the technologies of the future, and the expertise, the talent that you have in India, particularly in the best educational institutions. You feel there's huge scope for collaboration. Because, you know, look, for example, at the global ranking of universities, you know, 4 of the top 10 are in the UK. You know, we have the talent, we just need to use these initiatives and use the moment to make things happen.
Skill development, technology, jobs growth, all key priorities as well of the government. Arbinder, let me get your views in on this as well.
Sure, I think I would echo what's been said already, but for me it's taking a step back and assessing where we are on that journey. So I think we're very much on that journey. There was a real big euphoria 18 months ago with the election results. Everything's going to change overnight. It's going to take time. I think we've made steady progress. I think there was a big bang last week, and it was great to have that here. But it's very much kind of, you know, progressing with that and making some of those initiatives actually happen. So it was great last week to see some of the trade deals announced. But I think there's still plenty of room for improvement in that space. And I think, you know, in terms of ease of doing business, that was one of the #1 priorities when the elections were announced, etc., and moving forward with that. And you know, we've made progress in that, but it's still a long way to go.
Right. Okay, so we've already had the panelists outline some key challenges. Some of them want to come to you as well.
Thank you. Look, I'm an optimist.
Yeah.
And I think it's very easy to delve into the issues around the relationship around a particular country and the intricacies around that. But let's not forget, India has, what, 1.3 billion people, which is 20 times the size of UK, right? So when we put that perspective, and when you look at the intent and what the government is doing so far, I think it's, you would have a almost unanimous agreement amongst investors and amongst whether they are money, financial investors or business investors, that it's heading in the right direction and their voices are being heard, right? And you can debate which bits have worked faster, which bits have worked slower, but at the end of the day, that focus remains. Few stats, which are by external accreditation, right? This is what is called stars aligning. When you speak to investors, they talk about India as the shining light amongst all the emerging as well as developed markets in terms of markets that they're looking at. I think Ernst & Young came out last week and said they ranked India as the #1 in terms of investment destination. World Bank came out and talked about the growth story, about, you know, it's a $2.1 trillion economy, still growing at 7 to 8%. That's a pretty chunky number. Expected to double in the next 5 years. Expected to have a $30 trillion consumer market by 2030. Expected to have the largest, a quarter of the world's entire skilled workforce by 2020. These are staggering numbers, right? So when you look at that, and then you look at the initiative, whether it's in the Make in India initiative or the work we talk about from a railways sector perspective or defense or other conversations which we're having with the UK or life sciences or other things where there's strength of UK and there's obviously demand in India as well as strength in India, and the complementarity comes in pretty clearly around that. Just one number, FDI, first time ever, we are #1 in the pole position for the first half of 2015, receiving $31 billion according to the FT. These are staggering numbers. It's up 41% over last year. So you know, we can all say about the, there's always something which is not happening fast enough. But if you look at the intent, if you look at the direction, and if you look at the consensus view across the people see India as a bright spot. So I'd just end on that note. When you come across the spectrum, I'm actually far more bullish about it. But what we do need to understand is it's a 1.3 billion people country. It's complex. It's got a federal structure. And it has its own special characteristics. And some of these things take time.
So we've got the other point of view happening here. And Sumit, you're a bit of a minority on this panel. So I have a feeling you're going to get bullied a bit. But Stephen, do you want to respond to that?
Well, no, I mean, I think we're probably all optimists about India in some, in some very considerable respect. But I mean, I think I would echo some of the voices on the previous panel that said that nevertheless, you know, there are obstacles to doing business there. I mean, those are very impressive numbers. Here's some slightly less reassuring numbers to do with trade flows. Our trade is, in fact, falling. Europe's share of India's trade is falling. The UK's share of India's trade is falling. Now, of course, the pie is getting bigger, but we're getting a smaller and smaller slice of it. So the challenge, if you like, I think, is to work out how we reverse that number to make sure that it reflects some of the underlying positivity. I mean, I guess on the trade agenda, one of the big challenges for us, and this is where I think some of the current changes in India are very interesting, is that part of the problem in the past is that we've always had a bit of a mismatch in terms of what the two sides wanted to get out of the trade relationship. India, historically, particularly when you compare it to China, is not a huge exporter. And the attraction, particularly of manufactured goods, and the attraction of the European market, actually, for that reason, has often been quite limited. And domestic interests in India have never pushed for access to the European market for that reason. And while there are sectors, and someone on the previous panel flagged that very clearly, there are sectors where that pressure for trade is very strong. IT services, of course, in particular. Across the board, the interest in an FTA or a strategic trading relationship is very asymmetrical. Europeans are extremely bullish. They see a lot of opportunity. Indian companies, for different reasons, very focused on a very, very strong domestic market, only just beginning to develop the capacities for a big export push. And up to this point, we haven't been able to strike a deal on an FTA because of that mismatch in expectations. What's interesting about things like Make in India and the big push to go up the value chain on manufacturers is that they start to suggest we're moving into a world in which Indian exporters will see more interest in sitting down for a serious discussion about the strategic trading relationship with Europe. And then maybe we can re-energize the free trade agreement negotiations.
All right, so there seems to be, a sense of realignment that's required here from what both you and Professor have been saying. And I want to take, something from what Stephen said as well. What is the problem? Why are we seeing that fall in trade between the two countries? Why are we seeing the share of the pie decreasing? What are some of the major challenges, and how can these be overcome?
I think we're at a threshold, and then there's a generation change in terms of technology and how you use people. And the organisations that have been very successful at trading with India have been areas like providing traditional machine tools, instruments, various things that perhaps related to yesterday's technology rather than tomorrow's technology. And if you look at tomorrow's technology, and reference is always made to the huge number of young people in India. For example, looking for another 50 million places at universities, huge numbers. But if you care about India, as opposed to just seeing it as a business opportunity, then an asset can quickly become a liability. And if you look at the factory of the future, and you look at automated robots, expert systems linked to the internet, linked to 3D printers, you see manufacturing operations that don't actually need that many people. So in terms of all those massive numbers of young people, hundreds of millions of them in India, we don't want that asset to become a liability. Right. And of course, why I stress the importance of digital technologies, because they enable you to reach people. There are cost-effective ways of reskilling them, supporting people. And also, I think that the previous generation of relationships are very much based upon a small number of major family businesses that are remarkably successful, so I'm not in any way knocking them, and state enterprises that are doing great things. But in terms of the next wave of opportunity and generating employment opportunities for all those young people, you need entrepreneurs. So in other words, how do we move from this world of large family conglomerates and state enterprises and these established relationships on the last generation of manufacturing to this new digital world and creating the entrepreneurial opportunities, the creative opportunities. One is mentioning, the world of culture, coming up. I think, if you look at UK and the creative industries in the UK and the things that the UK has done, to actually support enterprise and entrepreneurship, creating new businesses, again, in that arena, I think there's huge opportunities. So I think there's a sea change, and there's all sorts of people that perhaps hitherto haven't thought necessarily of India, you know, should now seize the moment, you know, and see the fact that it is a strategic opportunity, because the human talent is enormous. You know, if I looked at groups that I've taught, you know, I remember, you know, I've been a visiting professor in India, and I've had groups at places like the Indian Institute of Management, and they'll be some of the most talented people that you can encounter on the planet. So if we can set them free to become entrepreneurs, then I think there's a whole new wave of opportunity we could create.
Yeah, and I think that's something the government has also started, or at least the new leadership, the Prime Minister has recognized and is trying to slowly put steps in place to sort of start that up. Arbinder, let me get you in here as a follow-up, and also where you see activity as well, which sectors you see maximum opportunity in.
Sure, so just to go back to the original question, just say my glass is half full, so I'm not half empty, just kind of where I am. I suppose those blockers, and it's a case of actually, it's progressing, it's moving forward with those, but, you know, I predominantly work with UK mid-market companies who are looking to go into India, and the challenges a mid-market company faces when they enter that market are very different to some of the larger conglomerates and where they're going. And I think for me, it's definitely improved, but I think 2 or 3 areas just to kind of focus on, and it will get better. You know, one is around corruption. You know, the perception we had on corruption, the issues and where we were. You know, the UK Bribery Act is a real issue for UK mid-market companies when they go into that market. So it's always seen as a challenge there, but actually addressing that and making that happen is another thing. So I think that's one area to improve on. And I think the other piece for me is around the taxation system. So where I work at BDO, we do a global ambition survey where we speak to 1,000 CEOs and CFOs and try and understand from them what are the challenges you face when you go into that particular market. And for India, undoubtedly, you know, the taxation system has been an issue. And we've made a huge amount of progress in the time in there, but I still think there's a long way to go on that. So there are the couple of areas on there. Okay, bring it to the half-full piece, and where are we? Bit of positivity. I think from a sector's perspective, you know, last week's announcements and where we were are a snapshot of where we are. So, you know, the financial services sector, as you can see, some of the fantastic announcements that came in from, you know, be that the bond market, the regulation on the pension side, you know, these are all positive steps, and I think the financial services market can be a real catalyst to grow. That from a mid-market perspective. So I think that's great. I think another sector we've touched on today, and it's going to be a key sector in the UK to India relationship, is aerospace and defence. Right. And it's not just the big players, it's a supply chain in aerospace and defence. And I think, you know, that opening up from 49 to potentially up to 100% depending on certain cases, it's going to have a great opportunity for us, because and the linkage to me on that piece is around technology. Right. So a lot of R&D rich opportunities we have here in the UK, and a lot of Indian businesses are now looking to exploit that, you know, in collaboration. And I think that's a great opportunity for us. Okay.
So, you know, one key word that seems to be coming across from a lot of what you've said is technology and how that's going to play a role. Sumit, how do you see that helping to facilitate things going forward as well?
I think technology is a great point. And to your point, look, India, as you know, is the 3rd largest startup ecosystem in the world. If you look at the focus on Startup India, it's all about converting people from being an employee to being an employer, and to create those jobs, because that's the only way you can have the leverage of the population dividend and the skills that we have. In fact, you know, the institution I graduated from, it's a place called IIT. So I went to IIT Delhi. Now the first choice for people is to go out and do a startup on their own. You know, it's not to join a McKinsey, it's not to join a banking career, it's not to join, you know, go abroad or whatever. They want to do a startup. Powai, IIT Powai, where IIT Bombay is based, that's the hottest startup location in India and probably on the planet, you know, except for probably Silicon Valley, in terms of the concentration of startups that exist out there. So you're absolutely right. There's a cultural change which is taken where risks which were deemed to be unacceptable by families are now deemed to be perfectly acceptable. It's okay to fail, right? And that's a big shift which is happening. A lot of these are technology driven, whether it's IT, whether you're looking at cabs, you're looking at other things, whether you look at genetics or genomics or other things. So there's a play around life sciences to e-sciences, e-commerce, to whatever, which is coming into play. That said, even on a traditional business side, you know, going back to an observation that you made, you know, what's lacking around the dialogue that we have, there's great intent. When we talk about UK, there's always India, there's always alignment on culture, there's alignment on values, there's alignment on history, there's alignment on, you'll have great stories. But when you look at what we are doing, going back to your trade point, trade is actually declining, right? It's $18 billion, less than 2% of the economy. It's not good enough. So just last week, on the financial markets, for example, London strength is financial markets. At State Bank of India, which is our holding company, our strength is India. So what we did was we actually heard what the investors are saying, and they're saying, look, we want to take part in the India growth story, particularly fixed income investors, and they were saying, but we can't have access because of this reason. So then RBI came out with the masala bond regime, which actually people welcomed. Then they're saying, oh, we've got issues around liquidity. And you said, oh, so what will be required to change that liquidity paradigm? Because you can't build liquidity overnight, you can't build yield curves overnight. And they said, well, these things will help. So that's where a bit of creativity, where Nikhil Rathi, who was on the earlier panel, and we got together and we said, look, what can we do to solve this problem? And that's where the FTSE State Bank of India bond indices was born, because a lot of investors said, we would love to invest in India, but we don't have we don't have the right weightage for India, so I can't put my passive funds onto it. That's just about the imagination of what is the end goal that we're trying to achieve. And then we've got the strength in the UK, we've got strength in India. How do we combine that? And across this room, I'm sure there are many such dialogues and conversations happening around scaling up, whether it's the big ticket things are in defense and other things. But that's what I think is happening. So people turning from employee to employer, and then people using their creativity and the smarts and the skills and the strengths that we have and the expertise we have to come together to solve certain problems.
I mean, it is really worth just stressing that point of just how big the underlying challenge is in terms of the structure of the Indian economy and the journey that it has to go on. 47% of Indians still basically work in agriculture, and the transition from that to something that looks more like a balanced modern economy is a huge journey, and it's going to take all of those reserves of entrepreneurialism and a huge amount of capital to finance essentially the industrialization process and the job creation in manufacturing and services. And I mean, it's worth just stressing that all of the stuff we're talking about, all the trade and investment, actually comes back to a big social policy challenge, which is how do you help that 47% of the Indian population make that big leap into an industrialized economy,
so, Stephen,
and a service-based economy.
So let's in fact talk about the way forward. When we are looking at a structural shift, when we're looking at the next big leap, as you've both highlighted here, what are some of the key things that need to be done? What would you like to see? You're talking about the FTA, but on ground now, going forward, what would be key priority areas?
Well, I mean, this is not, I mean, the recipe for successful diversification in an economy is hardly new. You need the capital to finance, you need the fixed capital, you need the skills. I mean, people have referred again and again to the extraordinary baseline in India in many respects. But the reality is, in an economy that's dedicated to adding value in manufacturing, high levels of literacy and high levels of numeracy are not enough. I mean, it needs to be a constant upgrading of the skills base. Someone on the previous panel talked about infrastructure. In an economy of India's size, absolutely crucial. You cannot build a manufacturing economy without interconnectivity. And of course, in the 21st century, that means digital infrastructure. And in fact, one of the things that Modi and Cameron agreed on last week was precisely this: a scaling up of the investment in skills, which is an area where the UK is extremely strong. Educational resources, and other sort of aspects of educational trade. But again, if you look at the and even something like Make in India, the Indian economy is comparatively closed to the import of industrial inputs, so the components of a manufacturing supply chain. That's been a problem for decades. It's very different from China. One of the reasons why China became the workshop of Asia is because you can import inputs for manufacturing in China for re-export. India has yet, I mean, if Make in India works well, it will mirror that process. It will plug India into global supply chains rather than trying to capture all of that production inside, some sort of domestic tariff war, which is really what we're looking at the moment.
All right. In terms of FDI, and I want to come back to that because we had huge sweeping announcements as well made last week. So a lot of the developments on that front ahead of the visits. In terms of sectors, and you know, you have spoken, Professor, already about how technology can change the game and how we're on the cusp of a new revolution. But in terms of the reform process and in terms of opening up, exactly what Stephen was also just talking about, what more would you like to see on that front?
Yeah, if you look at the sectors and areas of opportunity, I think one of the things we need to do is, in a sense, broaden the range of participants. If you're looking, for example, at dealing with environmental issues, it'd be nice to go to Delhi and be able to breathe in certain locations. And you think in the UK, we have environment cities, you know, some of which have done interesting things, you know, in terms of transportation, linking things up again, using digital applications. So I think linking cities to city, you know, professional firms to professional firms, as well as company to company. But in terms of sectors, the advantages on infrastructure we mentioned, you know, the biggest project in Europe is a Crossrail project in London. You know, we have all sorts of professional skills on project management that could be relevant. But if you come back to the area of skills, and what I said earlier, and having this concern that we don't awaken expectations and then disappoint. Earlier this year, I visited a factory in rural India, and the people working in that factory were the first generation to have any form of education. And if you walk around that factory today, you know, the quality being generated by those people literally is in the top, you know, 2 or 3% in the world. And the people are dexterous, you know, they're creative, they're imaginative. And if you look at Skill India and, you know, giving people basic skills, it may be that will awake an interest in learning. But we need to go all the way to survive in today's world.
Right.
You need advanced skills. You know, I believe the human capital in India is capable of getting there, and is capable of getting there very quickly. So in terms of what you need to do, you know, I look at things like transnational education. You know, I look at professional collaboration. But if you actually look at the details, and if you look at the regulatory framework in India, you know, India doesn't rank that highly in terms of ease of setting up you know, overseas educational activities, you know, getting the qualifications recognized, you know, things like the quality. You know, there are institutions of absolute excellence that are among the world's best, but there's a long tail of institutions, you know, that aren't of that quality. So in terms of getting that UK-India collaboration in higher education, you know, there are regulatory things that need to change. In terms of giving ambitious Indian companies access to the best professional expertise. You know, there are professional bodies in India, you know, that still have protected positions. You know, I'm a chartered accountant, but I would have issues, you know, practicing as a chartered accountant in India. You know, it would be good to have some regulatory changes that would actually open up and allow Indian businesses, you know, literally to get their professional services from the most relevant and the best, wherever they are, wherever they came from, you know, not just being required to, you know, to obtain it locally. So I think we can see the areas of opportunity. They are absolutely huge, and they're there. They are real. And but to get them, you know, there are a range of regulatory things, and the reality is, in some fields, there are still vested interests. And I think it's in everyone's interest that we work together, you know, to actually tackle some of those vested interests, you know, so we can't just ignore them.
No, and
they're getting in the way, some of them.
Well, I think that's the whole point of this dialogue that was initiated last week by the heads of state itself. The whole point is to address all these issues that do come up. I don't think there's any doubting intent or optimism as well, and of the willingness of companies to look at India as a serious investment option. But it's important to, of course, address some of these issues. Just as we wind up, Arbinder, there are also closing comments from you, because you mentioned the area of defense, and you know, we had some of our speakers here also talk about you know, the value chain and companies that could be important sourcing you know, ties as well to some of the bigger companies out there, and you work extensively with some of those mid-tier companies. Regulatory environment, any key things that you would like to see happen on the reform front over the next few months?
on a very positive note, I think the reforms which were announced on FDI, over the last 12 to 18 months are having a positive impact. So the fact, from my perspective, I'm seeing good deal flow happening in the mid-market going over to India. So destination India is definitely higher on the agenda than it has been in the last 5 years. So let's put it in context. It's a real improvement on there. I think it's a pace of change and letting them actually execute this. So the strategy is right. I think the defence opening up, as I said earlier, is a fantastic opportunity. But also some of the, just not to forget the supply chain. So take an example back. There was a bit of a backlash with regards to multi-brand retail.
Right.
However, actually, post that, and if some of these processes are happening, we're now seeing a lot of supply chain into retail going in.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. We're completely out of time on this panel. But gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts with us today.